Adel Thompson wheeled her bicycle through the narrow streets of Millbrook, her mailbag bouncing gently against her hip. At 48, she had found peace in this simple routine. Every morning at 7, she would load her bike with letters and packages, then spend the day visiting every house in their small mountain town. The morning air was crisp and clean. Mount Erebus stood tall in the distance, its peak often hidden by clouds. Most people in Millbrook barely noticed the volcano anymore. It had been quiet for over 50 years. They saw it as just another mountain, beautiful but harmless. But Adele knew better. She had spent 15 years studying volcanoes before coming to Millbrook. She understood their secrets, their warnings, their dangerous moods. Sometimes when she looked at Mount Erebus, memories of her old life came flooding back, like water breaking through a dam. Dr. Adel Thompson had once been one of the country's leading volcano researchers. She had traveled around the world, studying active volcanoes in Italy, Japan, Indonesia, and Iceland. Her team had been respected and successful. They had predicted several eruptions and helped save thousands of lives in places like Guatemala and the Philippines. She remembered the excitement of fieldwork, the hiss of steam vents, the sulfur smell that burned your nose, the ground that felt alive beneath your feet. She had loved the precision of scientific measurement combined with the thrill of studying one of nature's most powerful forces. Her research had focused on something called precursor analysis, identifying the warning signs that appeared before volcanic eruptions, temperature changes, gas emissions, seismic activity, ground deformation. Each volcano was like a puzzle with its own unique pattern of clues. Then came the day that changed everything. Mount Vesuvius in Italy had shown unusual activity. Adele and her team of 6 researchers had gone to study it closely. They had been working for 3 days, taking measurements and samples. The volcano had seemed stable according to all their instruments, but volcanoes can be unpredictable. On their 4th day, without warning, Vesuvius erupted violently. Adele had been collecting water samples from a hot spring 2 kilometers away when she heard the explosion. The sound was like the earth itself screaming. She ran toward the research station but could not reach her team. The eruption was too powerful, too dangerous. Pyroclastic flows, rivers of superheated gas and rock, were racing down the mountainside at over 100 miles per hour. The air filled with toxic gases and burning ash. All 6 of her colleagues died that day. Dr. Maria Santos, who had become like a sister to her. James Chen, the brilliant young seismologist. Professor Eric Larson, her mentor who had taught her everything about volcanic gas analysis. Sarah Kim, the geochemist who could identify mineral compositions just by looking at rock samples. David Martinez, the photographer who documented their work. And Dr. Robert Hayes, the team leader who had given her confidence to trust her scientific instincts. Adele survived only because she had been far from the main blast. She spent 3 days in an Italian hospital, treated for smoke inhalation and minor burns. But the physical injuries healed much faster than the emotional ones. The guilt and trauma had been overwhelming. She blamed herself for not seeing the warning signs. She questioned every decision the team had made. She replayed those final days over and over, wondering if there was something she could have noticed, some measurement that could have saved them. The investigation cleared her of any wrongdoing. The eruption had been what scientists called a cryptic eruption, one that showed very few precursor signs. Even with perfect knowledge and equipment, it would have been nearly impossible to predict. But knowing she wasn't technically at fault didn't ease the pain of losing her friends and colleagues. It didn't stop the nightmares or the panic attacks every time she smelled sulfur. It didn't silence the voice in her head that said she should have done more, been smarter, been better. She quit her job as a researcher 6 months after the tragedy. She sold her house in Colorado, packed her belongings, and drove until she found Millbrook, a place so far from any active volcano that she thought she could forget her past completely. For 3 years now, she had been the town's mail carrier. She enjoyed the simple work and the friendly people. Mrs. Patterson always offered her tea and homemade cookies. Mr. Garcia shared vegetables from his garden and told stories about his grandchildren. The Johnson children waited by their gate every Tuesday for their grandmother's weekly letter and always waved enthusiastically when they saw Adele coming. She had tried to forget her past completely. She never talked about volcanoes. She had packed away all her research books and equipment in boxes that she stored in her closet, unable to throw them away, but unwilling to look at them. When people asked about her previous job, she would just say she used to work for the government. Her small house on Maple Street was modest and comfortable. She had a garden where she grew tomatoes and herbs. She had adopted a cat from the local shelter, an orange tabby she named Ginger, who seemed to understand her need for quiet companionship. She attended the local Methodist church, though she struggled with questions about why good people died while she survived. She volunteered at the library, helping with their computer system. She had coffee with Sarah, the librarian, most Saturday mornings. But sometimes, especially when she looked at Mount Erebus, the old knowledge would stir in her mind like a sleeping giant. She would find herself automatically noting wind direction, checking for unusual cloud formations around the peak, listening for sounds that most people wouldn't even notice. She had convinced herself that this was just habit, like a retired teacher who still corrected grammar in casual conversation. She told herself it didn't mean anything, that Mount Erebus was completely different from the volcano she had studied. But deep down, some part of her never stopped being a scientist. Some part of her never stopped watching the mountain. Chapter 2. The First Signs. It was a Thursday morning in late September. The autumn air was crisp with the promise of winter, and the trees around Millbrook were beginning to show hints of gold and red. Adele was making her usual rounds, delivering mail to the houses on Elm Street. She had always loved this time of year in Millbrook. The summer tourists had gone home, leaving the town peaceful and quiet. The local farmers were harvesting their crops. Children were settled into their school routines. It was a time of comfortable predictability. She stopped at the Henderson house to deliver a package. The Hendersons were a young family with 2 small children. Mrs. Henderson was a teacher at the elementary school, and Mr. Henderson worked at the hardware store. They had always been friendly to Adele, often inviting her in for coffee when she delivered packages. As she walked up the garden path, she noticed something odd. The ground felt warm under her feet. Not just warm from the sun, but warm from below, as if there were heating pipes running underneath the walkway. She knelt down and pressed her palm to the earth. The soil was definitely warmer than it should be. In her scientific training, she had learned that ground temperature should remain relatively stable, varying only with seasonal changes and daily heating from the sun. But this felt different, a deeper, more consistent warmth. Adele tried to push the thought away. "It's probably nothing," she told herself. "Maybe a broken pipe underground, or maybe the morning sun hit this spot just right." But as she continued her route, she noticed more strange things. At the Miller house, their dog Bruno was acting restless. The normally calm golden retriever was pacing the yard, whining and refusing to go near his favorite sleeping spot under the oak tree. Animals, especially dogs and cats, often sense changes in the earth before humans do. They can detect subtle vibrations, changes in electromagnetic fields, and gas emissions that human senses miss. During her research years, Adele had interviewed dozens of people who reported unusual animal behavior before earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. At the park, she saw that some of the trees looked stressed. Their leaves were turning brown and dropping early, which could indicate root damage from heat or chemical changes in the soil. A few of the evergreen trees had brown tips on their needles, which sometimes happened when volcanic gases affected plant life. She told herself she was being paranoid, seeing patterns that weren't really there. After all, trees could be stressed by many things: drought, disease, insect damage, changes in soil nutrients. It didn't have to mean anything dramatic. But the combination of signs was troubling. Warm ground, stressed animals, dying vegetation, these were all classic early indicators of underground volcanic activity. That afternoon, Adele delivered mail to the library. She had become friends with Sarah Martinez, the librarian, over the past 3 years. Sarah was a curious person who loved learning about everything, from local history to new scientific discoveries. She was also one of the few people in town who knew that Adele had some kind of scientific background, though she didn't know the details. "You look worried, Adele," Sarah said, as she sorted through the library's mail. "Is everything okay?" Adele hesitated. She didn't want to seem crazy, but she needed to talk to someone. The observations from her morning route were nagging at her like an itch she couldn't scratch. "Sarah, have you noticed anything unusual lately? Any strange smells or sounds around town?" Sarah thought for a moment, tucking a strand of dark hair behind her ear. "Well, now that you mention it, the water in the fountain outside has been much warmer recently. I thought maybe the pipes were getting more sun or something, and last night I could swear I felt the house shake a little. My husband said it was just a big truck passing by, but we don't usually get heavy trucks through town at night." Adele's heart started beating faster. Warm water and small tremors were classic early warning signs of volcanic activity. Underground magma movement could heat groundwater and cause micro-earthquakes that were too small for most people to notice, but strong enough to make houses creak slightly. "Have you smelled anything unusual? Maybe like rotten eggs?" "Actually, yes. Yesterday when I was walking past the old hot spring in the park, there was a really strong sulfur smell, much stronger than usual. I figured maybe someone had thrown something in the water." Adele felt a chill run down her spine. Increased hydrogen sulfide emissions were another classic precursor sign. Magma moving closer to the surface would heat underground rocks and release gases that had been trapped for years. But she told herself to stay calm. It could still be something else. Maybe there really was a broken sewer pipe. Maybe the hot spring was just having a temporary change in its natural chemistry. Maybe the ground warming was just an unusually warm spell of weather. "Thanks for letting me know," she said to Sarah. "Probably nothing to worry about, but I like to stay aware of what's happening around town." That evening, Adele couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the warm ground, the stressed animals, the strange signs that Sarah had mentioned. Finally, she got up and went to her closet. In the back, behind her winter clothes, she found the box she had hidden away 3 years ago. Inside were her old research instruments, a digital thermometer for measuring ground temperature, a pH testing kit for checking water acidity, a portable gas detector for measuring sulfur emissions, and a small seismometer for detecting Earth movements. She also found her old textbooks and research journals, filled with her handwritten notes about volcanic precursor analysis. Adele held the equipment in her hands, remembering the excitement she used to feel when doing this work. The instruments felt familiar in her hands, like tools that belonged there. But she also remembered the pain of losing her team, the guilt that had driven her away from science. Did she really want to open this door again? Was she prepared to face the possibility that her worst fears might be coming true? She looked out her bedroom window at Mount Erebus, silhouetted against the star-filled sky. The mountain looked peaceful and beautiful, exactly as it had every night for the 3 years she had lived in Millbrook. But appearances could be deceiving. She knew that better than anyone. Chapter 3. Gathering Evidence. The next morning, Adele made a decision. She would do some basic tests, just to ease her mind. If everything was normal, she could pack the equipment away again and go back to her peaceful life. If something was actually happening, she would need to know so she could decide what to do next. She got up early, before her mail route, and took her bicycle to several locations around town. First, she went to Millbrook's Natural Hot Spring, a popular spot where families often came for picnics, and teenagers sometimes went to hang out. The spring had always been warm. That was its natural state. Local geology included geothermal features that had existed for centuries. But now the water was almost too hot to touch. She used her digital thermometer to measure the temperature. It was 15 degrees hotter than it should be, based on the measurements recorded by the town's historical society. She also tested the water's pH level using her chemical testing kit. The results showed the water had become much more acidic than normal. This was significant because rising magma would release acidic gases into groundwater, changing its chemical composition. These changes meant that hot, chemical-rich fluids were rising from deep underground. It was exactly what happened when magma moved closer to the surface, heating and pressurizing the water table above it.
Next, Adele visited 3 different locations around town to check ground temperatures. She chose spots that were shaded from direct sunlight to eliminate surface heating effects. In each place, the soil was 3 to 5 degrees warmer than it should be. The changes were small, but they were consistent and appeared to be growing stronger. Her portable gas detector picked up elevated levels of hydrogen sulfide and carbon dioxide in the air near ground level. These gases often escaped from soil when underground volcanic activity increased. Her small seismometer detected tiny earthquakes happening every few minutes. Most people wouldn't feel them, but they were there. Continuous micro-tremors that indicated movement of magma or heated fluids underground. By noon, Adele was certain. All the scientific evidence pointed to increased volcanic activity beneath Mount Erebus. The mountain was showing classic signs of awakening after decades of dormancy.
She had seen these exact patterns before in other locations. The temperature increases, the gas emissions, the microseismic activity, it all fit the textbook progression of volcanic reactivation. But what did it mean for Millbrook? How much time did they have? And what should she do with this information? The old Adele, the scientist, would have been excited by this discovery. She would have immediately contacted colleagues, set up monitoring stations, and begun a detailed study of the volcano's behavior. But the new Adel, the mail carrier who had found peace in Millbrook, was terrified, not just of the volcano, but of the responsibility this knowledge brought. She knew what volcanic eruptions could do to communities. She had studied the destruction of Pompeii, the devastation in Indonesia, the economic and human costs of modern eruptions. She also knew that volcanic predictions were extremely difficult and often imprecise. Increased activity could lead to an eruption in days, weeks, months, or even years. Some volcanoes showed warning signs for decades before erupting. Others erupted with very little warning at all. What if she was wrong? What if the signs she was seeing had some other explanation? What if she caused unnecessary panic and economic damage to a community that had welcomed her and given her a new life? But what if she was right? What if Mount Erebus was preparing to erupt, and her knowledge could help save lives? She spent the afternoon continuing her regular mail route, but her mind was racing. At every house, she found herself looking at the families inside and wondering if they understood the potential danger they were facing.
Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman who lived alone on Oak Street, watering her flowers in the front yard. The Martinez family, with 3 young children who always ran to greet the mail carrier. Tom Miller, who ran the local hardware store and coached Little League Baseball. Dr. Jennifer Park, the town's only physician, who worked tirelessly to care for everyone's health. These weren't just names on mail addresses anymore. They were her neighbors, her friends, her community. The thought of them facing a volcanic disaster without warning was unbearable. That evening, Adele made a decision that would change everything. She would continue gathering data for one more day, and then she would have to act on what she learned, regardless of the personal consequences. She also decided to do something she hadn't done in 3 years. She pulled out her old research journals and began reviewing everything she knew about volcanic eruption prediction and community evacuation procedures. The scientific knowledge came back to her like muscle memory. She remembered the patterns, the time frames, the warning signs that mattered most. She also remembered the protocols for working with local authorities and emergency management agencies. But most importantly, she remembered her responsibility as someone who possessed knowledge that could save lives. That responsibility didn't disappear just because she had changed jobs or moved to a small town. Dr. Adel Thompson was about to emerge from 3 years of hiding, whether she felt ready or not. The next morning brought more disturbing evidence. Adele woke up to find that Ginger, her usually calm cat, was acting extremely agitated. The orange tabby was pacing around the house, meowing constantly, and refusing to eat her breakfast. She kept trying to hide in the basement and seemed reluctant to go outside. Animal behavior had been one of Adele's secondary research interests during her scientific career. She had documented hundreds of cases where domestic animals showed unusual behavior before seismic events. Dogs barking continuously, cats hiding, horses refusing to enter barns, birds leaving an area en masse. These observations went back centuries in human records of natural disasters. Ginger had never acted this way before. In 3 years of living together, the cat had been consistently calm and predictable. This sudden change in behavior was another piece of evidence that something significant was happening underground. Adele dressed quickly and went outside to check her monitoring equipment. She had left the seismometer running overnight, and the results were alarming. The micro-earthquakes were becoming more frequent and slightly stronger. What had been occurring every few minutes yesterday was now happening almost continuously. She also noticed new physical changes around her neighborhood. A crack had appeared in the sidewalk in front of the Henderson house, a crack that definitely hadn't been there the day before. The crack was small, but it followed a straight line for about 10 feet, suggesting underground pressure changes that were affecting the surface. At the hot spring in the park, the situation was even more concerning. The water was now hot enough to create visible steam in the cool morning air. The surrounding grass was turning brown, killed by the heat and acidic gases. A few trees near the spring looked like they were dying, with leaves withering and falling off. Adele took careful measurements and photographs, documenting everything with the thoroughness that her scientific training had ingrained in her. If she was going to present this information to authorities or to the community, she needed to have solid evidence that couldn't be easily dismissed. But the more evidence she gathered, the more frightened she became. All the signs pointed to a volcano that was moving quickly toward an active state. In her experience, this pattern of escalating precursors usually meant an eruption was likely within days to weeks, not months or years. She thought about her research in Guatemala, where her team had observed similar patterns before the eruption of Volcán de Fuego. The ground warming, gas emissions, and micro-seismic activity had followed almost exactly the same progression she was seeing now in Millbrook. That eruption had destroyed several villages and killed over 200 people, despite evacuation efforts. The main difference was that in Guatemala, they had been monitoring the volcano and expecting activity. Here in Millbrook, no one was watching Mount Erebus except her. Adele realized she was facing the biggest ethical dilemma of her life. She had scientific evidence of serious volcanic danger, but she also had personal trauma that made her question her own judgment. What if her fear and guilt from the Italy disaster were causing her to see threats that weren't really there? She decided she needed an outside opinion. That afternoon, she used her personal laptop to contact Dr. Patricia Williams, a former colleague who now worked for the United States Geological Survey. Patricia had been one of the few people who had stayed in touch with Adele after she left the scientific community. In her email, Adele described the observations she had been making without revealing her location or the name of the town. She presented the data as if she were asking for help with a theoretical situation. Patricia's response came within hours. Adele, the patterns you're describing are extremely concerning. If this is a real situation, not a theoretical exercise, you need to contact local authorities immediately. The combination of ground heating, gas emissions, and increasing seismic activity suggests a volcano moving toward eruption in the near term. Where is this happening? Do you need help contacting the right people? Reading Patricia's response, Adele felt both validation and terror. Her scientific assessment had been correct. The danger was real and immediate. But that meant she now had to act on information that could save lives or create massive disruption, depending on how events unfolded. She spent that evening walking through downtown Millbrook, looking at the businesses and homes, thinking about the lives that could be affected by her next decisions. The pizza restaurant where teenagers gathered after school. The antique shop run by an elderly couple who had lived in Millbrook for 40 years. The daycare center where young mothers dropped off their children while they worked. How do you tell a community of 2,000 people that they might need to evacuate their homes because of a volcano that hasn't erupted in living memory? How do you convince them to take precautions based on scientific measurements that most people wouldn't understand? But more importantly, how do you live with yourself if you stay silent and people get hurt because of your inaction? Adele made her decision that night. The next morning, she would begin the process of warning her community, starting with the people in positions of authority and responsibility. She would start with Mayor Walsh, even though she had no idea how he would react to her information. She would present her credentials, her evidence, and her recommendations, and then let the political process take over. But she also began preparing for the possibility that official channels might not respond quickly enough. She researched emergency communication methods, evacuation procedures, and community organization strategies. If the authorities didn't take action, she might have to find other ways to protect her neighbors. Dr. Adele Thompson was about to step out of the shadows and back into the role she had tried so hard to leave behind. A scientist with knowledge that could save lives, whether or not anyone wanted to hear what she had to say.
Mayor Richard Walsh was a practical man in his early 60s who had spent his entire life in Millbrook. He had been a teacher, then a school administrator, before running for mayor 8 years earlier. He was well liked in the community for his common-sense approach to local government and his ability to balance the town's budget while maintaining essential services. Walsh was reviewing monthly budget reports in his office when Adele knocked on his door that Friday afternoon. The mayor's office was in the old town hall, a brick building constructed in the 1920s that also housed the police department, fire department, and municipal services. Adele, good to see you. What brings our favorite mail carrier to my office? Got some important government mail for me? He joked, gesturing for her to sit down. Mayor Walsh had always been friendly to Adele during her 3 years in Millbrook. He knew her as a reliable, quiet person who did her job well and contributed to community events. He had no idea about her scientific background or her previous career. Mr. Walsh, I need to talk to you about something serious. It's about Mount Erebus. The mayor's smile faded. The volcano? What about it? It's been quiet my whole life, and my father's whole life before that. Adele took a deep breath. This was the moment she had been dreading and preparing for. I think it's becoming active again. I've been noticing signs around town over the past few days. Ground temperature increases, changes in the hot spring, small earthquakes, gas emissions. I believe we might be in danger. Mayor Walsh looked confused and slightly concerned. Adele, I respect you, but how would you know about volcanoes? You're a mail carrier. I used to be a volcano researcher. I have a PhD in geological sciences from Colorado State University. I studied active volcanoes for 15 years before I came to Millbrook. I worked for the United States Geological Survey, and did fieldwork in Italy, Guatemala, Indonesia, and other locations. The mayor stared at her in surprise. "You never mentioned this before." "I had personal reasons for not talking about my past. But right now, that doesn't matter. What matters is that I'm seeing all the classic warning signs of volcanic reactivation. We need to contact the State Geological Survey Office and get experts here to confirm what I'm telling you." Adele opened her folder and spread out the data she had collected. Temperature measurements, photographs of ground cracks and vegetation changes, seismic readings from her personal equipment. These measurements show significant increases in ground temperature, changes in groundwater chemistry, and microseismic activity that all point to magma movement beneath Mount Erebus. In my professional opinion, this volcano is moving toward an active state and could potentially erupt in the near term. Mayor Walsh examined the papers and graphs, but it was clear that the scientific data was beyond his expertise. "Adele, even if what you're saying is true, I can't just evacuate the whole town based on your observations. Do you know what that would cost? What it would do to local businesses? What if you're wrong? People would think I'd lost my mind." "I'm not asking you to evacuate anyone yet. I'm asking you to call in official experts to verify my findings. Get seismic monitoring equipment here from the State Geological Survey. Have them send a team to assess the situation. If I'm wrong, we'll have lost a few days and some money. If I'm right, early preparation could save lives." Mayor Walsh was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with the implications of what Adele was telling him. Finally, he said, "I'll need to make some phone calls. Check with the County Emergency Management Office, maybe contact the state. Can you give me until Monday to look into this?" "Mr. Walsh, with respect, volcanic situations can develop very quickly. The signs I'm seeing suggest we may not have weeks or months. We might have days. Adele, I understand your concern, but I can't make major decisions based on incomplete information. Give me the weekend to research this properly." Adele left the town hall feeling frustrated and worried. She could see that Mayor Walsh was taking her seriously enough to investigate, but she also sensed his reluctance to act without official confirmation. She understood his position. He was responsible for the economic and social well-being of the entire community, not just emergency preparedness. But she also knew that bureaucratic processes often moved too slowly for natural disasters. By the time official experts arrived and completed their own assessment, it might be too late for effective evacuation if an eruption occurred. Over the weekend, Adele continued monitoring the situation with her equipment. The signs were getting stronger and more alarming. The ground temperatures were rising faster. The hot spring was now so hot that she had to post a handwritten warning sign telling people to stay away because the water could cause severe burns. The micro-earthquakes were becoming strong enough that some people in town were starting to notice them. Mrs. Patterson called Adele on Saturday evening to ask if she had felt the house shaking. Mr. Garcia mentioned that his dishes had rattled during dinner on Sunday night. On Saturday evening, Adele felt a tremor strong enough that books fell off a shelf in her living room, and Ginger ran to hide under the bed. She was certain now that they had very little time left before something major happened. She also noticed that wildlife behavior around town was becoming more unusual. Dogs were barking more at night. Several people mentioned that their cats were acting restless and hiding. Birds seemed to be leaving the area. The usual flocks of geese that gathered at the town pond were nowhere to be seen. On Sunday morning, Adele made another decision. If the official channels wouldn't act quickly enough, she would have to begin warning people directly. She knew it was risky. People might think she was crazy. She might lose her job and her place in the community she had grown to love. But she couldn't stand by and watch her neighbors face danger without warning them, even if her warnings weren't officially sanctioned. She started with people she knew best and trusted most. After church, she approached several families and told them about her concerns, showing them her credentials and some of her data. Sarah Martinez was the first person Adele told about her complete background and current concerns. They met at the library after church on Sunday, when the building was closed and they could speak privately. "I need to tell you something important, and I need your help," Adele began, sitting across from Sarah at one of the reading tables. She explained her scientific background, her work studying volcanoes, and the tragic accident in Italy that had driven her away from research. She described the signs she had been observing around Millbrook and her growing certainty that Mount Erebus was becoming active. Sarah listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions about the scientific evidence and Adele's assessment of the timeline. "So you think the mountain could erupt soon?" Sarah asked. "Based on the pattern of precursor signs and my experience with other volcanoes, yes. It could be days, weeks, or months, but I don't think we have the luxury of assuming it will be months. The escalation pattern suggests something more immediate. What do you need me to do?" "I need help reaching more people in the community. You know everyone in town through your work here at the library. You're respected and trusted. If I tell people about this alone, some will listen, but many will think I'm just a paranoid mail carrier. If you support my message, more people will take it seriously." Sarah nodded slowly. "I believe you. I've seen the changes you're talking about, and I know you well enough to trust your judgment. What's our strategy?" They spent the next 2 hours developing a plan. Sarah would use her connections with teachers, church members, and community groups to spread information about the potential volcanic threat. Adele would continue gathering scientific data and approaching people directly. They decided to organize an informal community meeting for that evening, using the library's phone system and Sarah's personal contacts to invite as many people as possible. Meanwhile, Adele began approaching other individuals who she thought might be influential in the community. Dr. Jennifer Park, the town's physician, was one of her first stops. Dr. Park was in her garden behind the medical clinic when Adele found her. She was a woman in her 40s who had moved to Millbrook 5 years earlier to escape the high stress of working in a large city hospital. She was known for her thorough, careful approach to medicine and her genuine concern for her patients. "Dr. Park, I need to speak with you about a public health emergency that might be developing," Adele said. She explained her background and her observations about increasing volcanic activity. Dr. Park listened with the careful attention of someone trained to assess potentially serious situations. "What kind of health risks are we talking about?" Dr. Park asked. "If Mount Erebus erupts, the immediate dangers would be pyroclastic flows, ashfall, and toxic gas emissions. Pyroclastic flows are the most dangerous. They're essentially rivers of superheated gas and rock that move at tremendous speed and destroy everything in their path. But even without pyroclastic flows, heavy ashfall can cause respiratory problems, especially for children and elderly people. Volcanic gases can be toxic at high concentrations." "And you think this could happen soon?" "The warning signs suggest increased activity that could lead to eruption within days to weeks. I can't be more precise than that, but the risk is real and growing." Dr. Park considered this information carefully. "What do you recommend we do?" "At minimum, people should prepare to evacuate temporarily. Have emergency supplies ready, know where they're going to go, have transportation arranged. If we get more definitive warnings, we need to be ready to move quickly." "I'll support your efforts to warn people," Dr. Park said. "From a public health perspective, it makes sense to err on the side of caution. I'll also start thinking about medical evacuation procedures for patients who might need special assistance." By Sunday afternoon, Adele had spoken to about 30 families and individuals. The responses varied widely. Some people took her warnings seriously and began making preparations. Others were politely skeptical. A few were openly dismissive. Tom Miller, who owned the hardware store, was in the skeptical category. "Adele, I've lived here my whole life, and that mountain has never done anything but sit there looking pretty. My grandfather used to say it was just a big hill with snow on top. Why would it suddenly become dangerous now? Because volcanoes can be dormant for decades or centuries, then become active relatively quickly, Adel explained. The fact that it's been quiet doesn't mean it's dead. The scientific evidence suggests it's waking up. Even if that's true, wouldn't the government be warning us? Wouldn't there be official announcements? This was the question Adel heard repeatedly. People expected that if there was real danger, they would hear about it through official channels. The idea that an individual citizen might have knowledge that authorities didn't possess was difficult for many people to accept. But some people were more receptive. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who always offered tea, was one of the first to take Adel's warnings seriously. "I've lived here 70 years, dear," she said. "I remember stories my grandmother told about the last time the mountain was active, back in the 1800s. She said there were hot springs that appeared suddenly, and the ground shook for weeks before the big eruption. If you think there's danger, I believe you." The Martinez family, Sarah's relatives, were also quick to begin preparations. They had 3 young children and understood the importance of being ready to leave quickly if necessary. By Sunday evening, Adel estimated that about half the people she had spoken to were taking some kind of precautionary action. Some were packing emergency bags and making plans to stay with relatives in other towns. Others were simply paying more attention to unusual signs around town. But she knew it wasn't enough. Millbrook had over 2,000 residents, and most of them hadn't heard her warnings yet. That night, as she prepared for the informal community meeting at the library, Adel felt the weight of responsibility heavier than ever. She was asking people to make significant decisions based on her scientific judgment. If she was wrong, she would disrupt lives and damage the trust she had built in the community over 3 years. If she was right, the coming days would test everything she had learned about science, leadership, and human nature. The library meeting that Sunday evening exceeded Adel's expectations. Over 300 people crowded into the main reading room, with more standing in the hallway and some listening from the doorway. Word had spread quickly through Millbrook's tight-knit community networks. Sarah introduced Adel by explaining that their mail carrier had important safety information to share with the community. The crowd was curious but skeptical. Most people still saw Adel as a friendly but quiet service worker, not someone who would have expertise about geological emergencies. Adel stood at the front of the room, holding her research materials and feeling more nervous than she had in years. These people had known her as just their reliable mail carrier for 3 years. Now she was asking them to trust her with information that could change their lives. "Good evening, everyone. I know this is unusual, and I know some of you are wondering why your mail carrier called a town meeting. I'm here tonight because I believe our community is facing a serious natural disaster, and I have information that could help keep you and your families safe."
She began by explaining her background as Dr. Adel Thompson, volcano researcher. She showed her PhD diploma from Colorado State University, several published research papers with her name on them, and photographs from her fieldwork around the world. "I spent 15 years studying active volcanoes before I came to Millbrook. My team predicted several eruptions that allowed thousands of people to evacuate safely. I came here 3 years ago for personal reasons, but I never stopped understanding how volcanoes work." The crowd murmured with surprise. Many people were seeing a completely different side of someone they thought they knew well. Adel then presented the data she had collected over the past week: temperature readings, photographs of ground changes, water chemistry results, and seismic measurements from her portable equipment. All of these signs point to one conclusion: Mount Erebus is becoming active after 50 years of dormancy. The ground is heating up from below. Underground water is becoming more acidic and much hotter. Small earthquakes are occurring almost continuously now. Gas emissions are increasing. She explained what each type of evidence meant in terms of volcanic processes, using language that non-scientists could understand. "These are textbook precursor signs. the warnings that volcanoes give us before they erupt. Based on my experience studying similar patterns in other locations, I believe we could see an eruption within days to weeks. The room erupted in concerned voices. Some people looked scared, others skeptical, some angry. Tom Miller stood up from his seat near the back. This is ridiculous. That mountain has been quiet my whole life, and my father's whole life. My family has been in this valley for 4 generations, and nobody ever worried about the volcano. Why should we believe it's suddenly dangerous now? Because volcanoes can stay quiet for decades or even centuries, then become active very quickly, Adel replied. Mount St. Helens in Washington was dormant for over 120 years before it erupted in 1980. Galeras in Colombia had been quiet for decades before it killed 6 scientists and 3 tourists in 1993. Long dormancy doesn't mean a volcano is dead. Maria Santos, one of the teachers at the elementary school, raised her hand. If this is true, what should we do? What are you recommending? My recommendation is that families should prepare to leave town temporarily if conditions worsen. Pack essential items, medications, important documents, a few days of clothing, have a plan for where you'll go, relatives in other towns, hotels, whatever works for your family. Have transportation ready. If I'm wrong, you'll have lost a few days and maybe spent some money on accommodations. If I'm right, preparation could save your life. Dr. Park stood up from her seat in the middle of the room. Adele, I've noticed several patients complaining about headaches, nausea, and breathing problems over the past week. Could that be related to what you're talking about? Yes, absolutely. Volcanic gases like hydrogen sulfide and sulfur dioxide can cause exactly those symptoms. Carbon dioxide can cause dizziness and fatigue. The fact that you're seeing an increase in these complaints supports the evidence of increased gas emissions. An elderly man named Frank Peterson raised his hand. What about the government? Shouldn't they be monitoring this? Why aren't we hearing warnings from official sources? This was the question Adele had been dreading. The nearest volcanic monitoring station is over 100 miles away. Mount Erebus has been quiet for so long that it's not being closely watched. The State Geological Survey has limited resources and focuses on volcanoes that are known to be active. By the time they detect the activity and send a team here, it might be too late for effective evacuation. So you're saying we should trust your word over official agencies? Peterson pressed. I'm saying that in emergency situations, sometimes individuals have to act on available information rather than waiting for perfect institutional responses. I have the training to recognize these warning signs, and I have a responsibility to share that information with my community. For the next hour, Adele answered questions about volcanic hazards, evacuation procedures, and emergency preparedness. She explained the difference between different types of volcanic eruptions, the various dangers people might face, and the timeline for how events might unfold. Linda Chen, a nurse who worked with Dr. Park, asked about medical considerations. What about people who can't easily evacuate? Elderly residents, people with disabilities, patients who need regular medical care? That's one of the most important reasons to prepare early, Adele replied. If we wait until an eruption is imminent, we won't have time to arrange special transportation and care for people who need extra assistance. Planning now gives us options. Father Miguel Rodriguez from the Catholic Church asked about communication. If phone lines go down or roads are blocked, how will people know what's happening? We need backup communication methods, Adele said. Battery-powered radios, designated meeting points, buddy systems where neighbors check on each other. In volcanic emergencies, community cooperation is essential. By the end of the meeting, the mood in the room had shifted. While some people remained skeptical, Most were taking Adele's warnings seriously enough to consider precautionary measures. As people filed out, many stopped to thank Adele for the information and to ask follow-up questions. Mrs. Patterson hugged her and said, "You're very brave, dear. I know this couldn't have been easy for you." But Adele didn't feel brave. She felt terrified that she might be wrong, and equally terrified that she might be right. That night, Adele barely slept. Every few hours, she checked her seismometer and found the readings getting progressively worse. The ground was shaking almost continuously now, though the tremors were still too small for most people to notice without instruments. At 3 in the morning, she was awakened by a sound she hoped she would never hear again. The deep, rumbling growl that came from inside a mountain when magma was moving upward through rock. It was a sound that most people would mistake for distant thunder, but Adele knew what it really meant. She got dressed quickly and rode her bicycle through the empty streets by moonlight. In several places, she could see new cracks in the pavement where the ground had shifted slightly. Some of these cracks were steaming, indicating that hot gases were escaping through fractures in the earth. At the original hot spring in the park, the situation was alarming. The spring was now boiling violently, creating so much steam that visibility was limited within 50 feet. The surrounding grass had died completely, killed by the heat and acidic gases. Several trees near the spring looked like they were dying, with leaves withering and bark beginning to peel. But most disturbing were the new hot springs that had appeared overnight. Water was bubbling up through cracks in the ground in 3 locations where there had never been thermal features before. One was in the parking lot behind the grocery store. Another was in Mrs. Patterson's backyard. The third was in the middle of Elm Street, creating a small geyser that was erupting every few minutes. Adele took photographs and measurements of these new features, but she was also calculating what they meant. When new hot springs appeared suddenly, it usually indicated that magma was rising rapidly underground, heating groundwater and creating pressure that forced heated fluids to find new escape routes to the surface. This pattern of escalating activity was exactly what she had observed in Guatemala before the eruption of Volcán de Fuego. New thermal features appearing overnight, followed within 24 to 48 hours by more significant explosive activity. She rode quickly through town, checking on other areas and documenting changes. The smell of sulfur was now strong enough that even people with poor senses of smell would notice it. Several car alarms were going off, apparently triggered by ground vibrations. At 4:30 a.m., Adele felt a tremor strong enough to knock her off her bicycle. It lasted for nearly 30 seconds, much longer and stronger than the micro-earthquakes she had been recording. This was significant seismic activity that everyone in town would have felt. She knew these were the final warning signs. Mount Erebus was going to erupt very soon, probably within hours rather than days. Adele rode quickly to the homes of the families she knew were taking her warnings seriously, waking people up and urging them to leave immediately. At each house, she explained that the danger had become critical and imminent. The Martinez family was already awake. Their baby had been crying, and the parents had felt the ground shaking. They had packed after the library meeting and were ready to load their car. "Should we go now?" Sarah's cousin Elena asked. "Yes, I think you should leave as soon as possible," Adele replied. "Take the main highway toward the county seat. Don't stop until you're at least 20 miles from town." At the Henderson house, the young parents were confused and frightened by being awakened at 4:30 a.m., but they could see the urgency in Adele's manner. "I know this is scary and disruptive, but the volcanic activity has increased dramatically in the past few hours. New hot springs have appeared around town, and the seismic activity is getting much stronger. I believe an eruption could happen within hours." Some families, like the Hendersons, had already packed after the meeting and were ready to go, Others needed time to gather their belongings and make arrangements. A few were still reluctant to leave based on what they saw as uncertain predictions. Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman who lived alone, was one of the more difficult cases. She was frightened by the idea of leaving her home, especially in the middle of the night. "Please," Adele begged. "You don't have to believe everything I've said, but please just come with me for today. I'll drive you to the community center in the next town. If nothing happens, I'll bring you back tomorrow and personally apologize for worrying you." Mrs. Chen finally agreed, gathering her medications and a few personal items, while Adele helped her into her own car. By sunrise, Adele had personally evacuated about 50 people from the most at-risk areas of town. Many others were leaving on their own, either because they had heard her warnings or because they were finally noticing the obvious signs of underground activity. But she estimated that at least 1,500 people were still in town, either because they hadn't heard the warnings, didn't believe the danger was real, or felt they couldn't leave their homes and businesses. As the sun came up, Adele could see that the situation was becoming impossible to ignore. Steam was rising from multiple locations around town. The smell of sulfur was noticeable everywhere. The ground vibrations were strong enough that most people could feel them. Yet many residents were still going about their normal Monday morning routines, getting children ready for school, opening businesses, preparing for another ordinary day.
At 7 in the morning, Mayor Walsh finally issued an evacuation advisory, but he made it voluntary rather than mandatory. The announcement went out on local radio and through the town's emergency notification system. This is Mayor Walsh with an important message for Millbrook residents. Based on recent geological observations indicating increased activity from Mount Erebus, we are recommending that residents consider temporarily relocating as a precautionary measure. We emphasize that this is a precautionary advisory only, and there is no immediate emergency. Residents who choose to leave temporarily should use normal evacuation routes and avoid panic. Adele was frustrated by how weak and cautious the message sounded, but at least it was something. She hoped it would convince more people to take the situation seriously. The mayor's announcement did prompt more activity. The local radio station began broadcasting regular updates about the situation. The elementary school announced that it would be closed for the day as a precaution. Several businesses began making plans to shut down temporarily. But the response was still too slow and incomplete for Adele's comfort. Many people were treating the evacuation advisory as a suggestion they could consider later, not as an urgent recommendation for immediate action. She spent the morning helping coordinate evacuations and providing information to anyone who would listen. Sarah had turned the library into an informal information center where people could get updates, find transportation help, and coordinate with neighbors. Dr. Park had set up a temporary medical station to help elderly or disabled residents who needed assistance evacuating. She was working with several volunteers to arrange special transportation for people who couldn't drive themselves or didn't have access to vehicles. Several ministers and community leaders were going door to door in their neighborhoods, encouraging people to take the evacuation advisory seriously. But progress was still slower than the escalating volcanic activity warranted. At 9 o'clock, the situation took a dramatic turn. Adele was helping load an elderly man into a car when she heard a sound that made her blood freeze, a sharp, explosive crack that echoed across the valley like a gunshot. She looked up at Mount Erebus and saw a small but unmistakable cloud of steam and ash rising from the peak. The mountain had just produced its first steam explosion in over 50 years. "Everyone, listen!" she shouted as loudly as she could to the people gathered in the downtown area. "That was a steam explosion! The mountain is starting to erupt. We need to get everyone out of town right now." The steam explosion had a galvanizing effect on people who had been hesitant about evacuating. The visual evidence of volcanic activity, an actual cloud rising from the mountain, made the danger undeniable. Cars began filling with families and their belongings. The orderly evacuation advisory became a much more urgent mass exodus. But Adel could see that it still wasn't happening fast enough. With 1,500 people still in town and limited transportation, it would take hours to evacuate everyone safely. And based on her experience with volcanic eruptions, they probably had less than an hour before much more dangerous activity began. Steam explosions were often followed within hours by more violent eruptions involving pyroclastic flows and heavy ashfall. She knew they were running out of time. At 9:15, there was a second steam explosion, larger than the first, then a third at 9:22. Each explosion sent a bigger cloud of steam and ash into the sky, and each one was visible from anywhere in the valley. People were now taking the evacuation seriously, but the limited road capacity and the time required to gather belongings meant that hundreds of residents were still in danger zones. Adel made a quick decision. She needed to organize this evacuation like a military operation, with clear priorities and efficient systems, or a lot of people were going to be in serious danger very soon. Adel rode her bicycle to the highest point in town, the bell tower of the old Methodist church, and began ringing the bell continuously. The loud, urgent sound carried across the entire valley, a universal alarm that brought people out of their houses to see what was happening. From the tower, she could see the entire town laid out below her, and she could see Mount Erebus clearly. More steam and ash clouds were rising from the peak, and she could see that the activity was intensifying quickly. "Mount Erebus is erupting," she shouted to the crowd that gathered below the church. "Everyone needs to leave town immediately. Take only essential items and get to the main highway as quickly as possible." She climbed down from the bell tower and began organizing the evacuation with the systematic approach she had learned during emergency response training in her scientific career. The key was to prioritize the most vulnerable people and the most dangerous areas, while using every available resource efficiently. "We need to divide the town into sections and make sure every area gets covered," she announced to the group of volunteers who had gathered around her. "I need teams to go door to door in each neighborhood, making sure no one gets left behind." She quickly sketched a map of Millbrook on a piece of paper, dividing it into 6 zones. She assigned 2 or 3 volunteers to each zone, giving them specific instructions about what to look for and how to help people evacuate. "Check every house, even if you think people have already left," she told each team. "Look especially for elderly residents, people with disabilities, anyone who might need extra help. Don't assume someone heard the warnings or has transportation." Sarah took charge of coordinating transportation, matching people who needed rides with people who had extra space in their vehicles. Dr. Park organized medical assistance for residents who needed help moving or had health conditions that required special attention. Father Rodriguez and 2 other ministers volunteered to drive to the most remote houses outside the main town area, farms and isolated residences that would take longer to reach and evacuate. Meanwhile, the mountain continued its ominous progression. Every few minutes, another steam explosion would send a dark cloud into the sky. The ground shaking was now strong enough that everyone could feel it, and some of the older buildings in town were showing signs of stress from the continuous vibrations. At the town's small medical clinic, Dr. Park was working frantically to evacuate 3 patients who were on oxygen and couldn't easily be moved. "We need ambulance service," Dr. Park told Adel when she arrived to check on the medical evacuation. "The closest ambulance is over 40 minutes away, and we don't have that much time," Adel replied. "We'll have to make do with what we have." She organized several volunteers to help carry the patients to cars with good suspension that could transport them more smoothly than an ambulance. It wasn't ideal, but it was their only option, given the time constraints. One of the patients was Frank Peterson, the elderly man who had been skeptical at the library meeting. As volunteers helped him into a neighbor's car, he grabbed Adel's hand. "I'm sorry I doubted you," he said. "Thank you for trying to save us even when we didn't listen." As the evacuation continued, Adel rode her bicycle constantly between different parts of town, coordinating efforts and solving problems as they arose. When the Johnson family's car wouldn't start, she helped them get rides with neighbors. When old Mr. Peterson refused to leave his house, she spent precious minutes convincing him that his safety was more important than his possessions. The most challenging area was the mobile home park on the east side of town, where many elderly residents lived on fixed incomes and didn't have reliable transportation. Adel organized a convoy of pickup trucks and vans to carry these residents to safety, along with whatever belongings they could quickly gather. By 11 a.m., most of the town had been evacuated, but there were still scattered individuals and families who were either unaware of the danger or unwilling to leave. The volcanic activity was continuing to intensify, with steam explosions now occurring every few minutes and ash beginning to fall lightly in some parts of town. Adel was exhausted from the physical and emotional strain of organizing the evacuation, but she was also grimly satisfied that their emergency response was working. The systematic approach was getting people out of danger zones efficiently, and the community cooperation was better than she had hoped. But she knew the most dangerous phase was still coming. At 12:47 p.m., exactly 3 hours and 47 minutes after the first steam explosion, Mount Erebus erupted with full explosive force. The explosion was visible and audible from 50 miles away. A massive column of ash and gas shot 15,000 feet into the air within minutes. The sound was like continuous thunder that wouldn't stop, rolling across the landscape and rattling windows in towns 30 miles from Millbrook. Adel was helping evacuate the last families from the residential area closest to the mountain when the main eruption began. The force of the initial explosion knocked her off her bicycle and sent a shock wave that broke windows throughout the town and triggered car alarms across the valley. The eruption column rose like a giant black tree, spreading at the top into the distinctive mushroom shape that indicated a major volcanic explosion. Lightning flickered within the ash cloud as static electricity built up from the friction of volcanic particles. But the evacuation plan had worked. The most dangerous area of town, the residential neighborhoods on the slopes facing the mountain, was now empty except for Adel and 2 other volunteers who had stayed to complete the final sweep. "We need to go now," shouted Mike Harrison, one of the volunteers who had been checking houses in the area closest to Mount Erebus. "Look at that ash cloud." The volcanic ash cloud was spreading rapidly, carried by the wind directly toward Millbrook. In minutes, the entire town would be covered in a choking cloud of hot ash and toxic gases that could kill anyone caught outside without protection. The 3 of them ran to Mike's pickup truck and drove quickly toward the main highway, racing against the advancing ash cloud. Behind them, the town they had worked so hard to evacuate was disappearing under a dark blanket of volcanic debris. The ashfall began just as they reached the highway. Heavy, hot particles pelted the windshield like hail, and Mike had to turn on his headlights even though it was the middle of the day. The air became so thick with ash that visibility dropped to just a few feet. They drove slowly through the ash storm until they reached the evacuation assembly point 3 miles from town, where hundreds of cars filled with Millbrook residents were parked along the highway shoulder. People were standing outside their vehicles despite the falling ash, looking back at the massive eruption in amazement and terror. The sound of the eruption was still audible even at this distance, a constant roar that seemed to come from the earth itself. Mayor Walsh found Adel in the crowd of evacuees. His face was covered with ash, and his voice was shaking with emotion. "I owe you an apology," he said. "And probably more than that. You saved this town. If we had waited for official confirmation from state agencies, hundreds of people would still be in their houses when that eruption started." "We all saved this town," Adel replied, though she had to shout to be heard over the sound of the eruption. "Everyone who helped with the evacuation, everyone who listened to the warnings and left when they could, everyone who helped their neighbors." It was a community effort. But even as she said it, Adel was doing a mental count of the cars and people around her. Had they gotten everyone out in time? Sarah appeared through the crowd, carrying a clipboard, and looking exhausted but determined. "I've been trying to account for everyone," she called to Adel. "All the families I can think of are here, but I'm worried about some of the people who live alone. Have you seen Mrs. Patterson or the Williams family from the farm on Cedar Ridge Road?" Adel felt a surge of panic. In the chaos of the final evacuation, it was possible that some people had been missed, especially those who lived in isolated areas or didn't have strong connections to community networks. "We need to organize a formal head count," she said. "Get representatives from each neighborhood to account for their residents." For the next hour, as the eruption continued behind them, the evacuated residents worked to make sure everyone was safe. They used cell phones to contact people who might have evacuated on their own to other locations. They checked with relatives and friends to account for anyone who wasn't at the main assembly point. The process was complicated by the fact that some people had left town earlier in the day or had been visiting relatives elsewhere when the evacuation began, but gradually they were able to account for nearly everyone. The final count showed that over 1,950 of Millbrook's 2,000 residents had been safely evacuated. The missing 50 included people who were traveling, some who had left town days earlier after Adel's first warnings, and a few who couldn't be immediately located. The eruption of Mount Erebus continued for 6 hours, sending ash and gas high into the atmosphere and covering Millbrook with 3 feet of hot volcanic debris. The pyroclastic flows that Adel had feared most never materialized. The eruption was primarily explosive rather than effusive, meaning it sent material high into the air rather than flowing down the mountainside. This was fortunate because pyroclastic flows would have killed anyone remaining in town and made rescue efforts impossible. Instead, the main dangers were the heavy ashfall, toxic gases, and the collapse of some buildings under the weight of accumulated volcanic debris. If people had still been in town during the eruption, hundreds would have died from asphyxiation, building collapses, or respiratory failure from inhaling hot ash. The volcanic gases alone, primarily sulfur dioxide and hydrogen sulfide, reached concentrations that would have been lethal within minutes. But thanks to Adel's early warning and the community's response, every single resident of Millbrook survived. The evacuation had been completed with only minutes to spare before conditions became deadly. In the days following the eruption, Adel found herself at the center of media attention she had never wanted. Reporters came from across the country to interview the mail carrier who predicted the eruption. The story appeared on national television news and in newspapers around the world. Dr. Thompson's early recognition of volcanic precursors and her courage in warning the community despite initial skepticism represents exactly the kind of scientific heroism our society needs, said Dr. Patricia Williams from the United States Geological Survey in a televised interview. Her actions demonstrate the critical importance of having qualified observers in volcanic regions, even when those volcanoes are not being actively monitored. The scientific community was particularly interested in Adel's documentation of the eruption's precursor signs. Her detailed measurements and photographs provided valuable data about how dormant volcanoes behave when they reactivate. The Millbrook eruption will become a textbook case for volcanic hazard assessment, said Dr. Michael Rodriguez from the Smithsonian's Global Volcanism Program. Dr. Thompson's systematic observation and measurement of precursor phenomena provides an excellent example of how to recognize and respond to volcanic reactivation. But the attention made Adel uncomfortable. She had acted not as a scientist seeking professional recognition, but as a community member trying to protect her neighbors. "I didn't do anything special," she told reporters. "I just used the training I had to help my community when I saw they were in danger. Anyone with similar knowledge would have done the same thing." The state government awarded her a medal for civilian heroism. The mayor and town council passed a resolution declaring her an honorary citizen of Millbrook. The Postal Service offered her promotions and recognition. More importantly to Adel, the people of Millbrook never forgot what she had done for them. Even while they were staying in temporary shelters and hotels, waiting to learn when they could return to their town. Families approached her constantly to thank her for saving their lives. "You gave us our children's futures," Elena Martinez told her, holding her 3-year-old daughter. "If you hadn't warned us, if you hadn't made us take it seriously, we would have been in our house when that mountain exploded." There are no words for that kind of gratitude.
Most importantly, the new Millbrook incorporated volcanic hazard awareness into every aspect of community planning. Children learned about volcanic processes in school. Adults attended regular preparedness workshops. The town developed detailed evacuation procedures and practiced them annually. Adele had expected to go back to her quiet life as a mail carrier after the initial media attention died down, but the eruption had changed that possibility forever. The experience had reconnected her with her scientific identity in ways she hadn't expected. The National Geological Survey offered her a position developing community-based early warning systems for volcanic regions. Several universities wanted her to head their volcanic hazards research programs. The Federal Emergency Management Agency asked her to help develop training programs for disaster preparedness in small communities. After much consideration, she decided to accept a part-time position with the Geological Survey that would allow her to stay in Millbrook while also returning to scientific work. Her job would be to help other small communities near volcanoes develop evacuation plans and train local leaders to recognize warning signs. "I learned something important during this experience," she told Sarah one day, as they walked through the rebuilt downtown area. "I spent 3 years trying to forget my past and live a completely different life. But I realize now that our experiences, even the painful ones, are meant to be used to help others." "Do you ever think about your team that died in Italy?" Sarah asked gently. "Every day," Adele replied. "But now, instead of just feeling guilty about surviving, I try to honor their memory by using what I learned to protect other people. I think they would have wanted their deaths to mean something, to help prevent other tragedies." The new Millbrook had become a model community for volcanic hazard preparedness. The town now hosted international conferences on disaster planning and community resilience. Scientists and emergency management professionals came from around the world to study how a small community had successfully evacuated in the face of a volcanic emergency. Adele kept her bicycle and continued delivering mail part-time, because those personal connections with her neighbors had been crucial to the successful evacuation. People had trusted her warnings partly because she had spent 3 years earning their trust through daily acts of service and kindness. "The most important lesson from our experience," she would tell visitors, "is that disaster preparedness isn't just about having the right equipment or procedures. It's about having relationships of trust within a community. People listen to warnings from people they know and respect." 2 years after the eruption, Adele was invited to speak at the International Conference on Volcanic Hazards in Tokyo. Standing before hundreds of scientists, emergency managers, and government officials from around the world, she reflected on what the Millbrook experience had taught them about community-based disaster response. "The most important factor in our successful evacuation wasn't scientific equipment or government resources," she told the international audience. "It was community relationships and trust. People listened to my warnings not primarily because of my degrees or credentials, but because they knew me as someone who cared about them and had proven reliable over time." She continued, "We also learned that official channels of communication can be too slow in rapidly developing emergencies. Sometimes individuals need to take initiative and work outside normal bureaucratic processes to protect their communities. But this only works when those individuals have both the technical knowledge to assess situations correctly and the social connections to communicate effectively. Most importantly, we learned that past experiences, even traumatic ones, can become sources of strength and service to others if we choose to use them that way. My tragedy in Italy prepared me to recognize the danger in Millbrook and gave me the motivation to act despite personal discomfort." After her presentation, a young graduate student from the Philippines approached her. "Dr. Thompson, I'm studying volcanology, and your story has inspired me to focus on community-based early warning systems. But I'm wondering, weren't you afraid people would blame you if you were wrong? What if the mountain hadn't erupted?" Adele smiled. "I was absolutely terrified of being wrong. But I realized that the consequences of being wrong were much less serious than the consequences of being right and not speaking up. If I had been wrong, people would have lost a few days and some money on temporary accommodations. If I had been right and stayed silent, people would have lost their lives." The courage to act despite uncertainty is one of the most important qualities for anyone working in disaster preparedness. We rarely have perfect information, but we often have enough information to take reasonable precautions. A government official from Indonesia asked about the role of local knowledge versus official expertise. In our country, we sometimes have conflicts between what local scientists observe and what government agencies are willing to announce. How do we balance individual assessment with institutional responsibility? "That's one of the most difficult challenges in emergency management," Adele replied. "Institutions have legitimate concerns about false alarms, economic impacts, and public panic. But they also have to balance those concerns against the potential cost of being too cautious when lives are at stake. I think the key is developing systems that allow for rapid consultation and decision-making when time is critical. Communities need both individual observers who can recognize emerging threats and institutional processes that can respond quickly when threats are identified." The conference led to several collaborative projects. Adele began working with researchers in different countries to develop training programs for community-based volcanic monitoring. They created materials that taught local leaders how to recognize precursor signs, how to communicate with official agencies, and how to organize effective evacuations. She also became involved in developing technology that could make volcanic monitoring more accessible to remote communities. Simple, inexpensive instruments that could detect ground temperature changes, gas emissions, and seismic activity, combined with communication systems that could alert authorities and nearby populations. But perhaps most importantly, she began documenting the psychological and social aspects of disaster preparedness. Her experience had taught her that the technical ability to detect threats was only part of the challenge. Equally important was the ability to communicate effectively about uncertain risks and to motivate appropriate responses from communities that might not understand the science involved. "Fear and denial are natural human responses to information about potential disasters," she wrote in one of her research papers. People often resist warnings not because they don't understand the technical information, but because accepting the warnings requires them to confront their own vulnerability and make difficult changes to their lives. Effective disaster communication requires understanding not just the science of the hazard, but the psychology of how people process threatening information and make decisions under uncertainty.
5 years after the eruption, Millbrook had been completely rebuilt and had developed into something more resilient and community-minded than it had been before the disaster. The volcanic activity had actually brought some unexpected benefits to the area, attracting scientists and tourists interested in studying and observing active volcanism safely. Mount Erebus remained active but manageable, with constant monitoring from a network of instruments installed by the USGS after the eruption. The local population was well educated about volcanic hazards and had regular evacuation drills. What had once been a community that ignored its volcanic neighbor had become one that respected and prepared for its power. Adele had found a perfect balance between her scientific work and her community connections. She spent half her time working with the Geological Survey on volcano monitoring and community preparedness programs around the world. The other half she continued as Millbrook's mail carrier, maintaining the personal relationships that had made the evacuation possible. Her house on Maple Street had been rebuilt after the eruption, and she had expanded her garden to include a small greenhouse where she grew vegetables year-round. Ginger had survived the evacuation and relocation, though the elderly cat had developed a permanent nervousness around loud noises that reminded Adele daily of their shared experience of the disaster. On quiet mornings, as she loaded her bicycle with mail and began her rounds through the rebuilt streets of Millbrook, Adele would often reflect on how dramatically her life had changed. She had learned to integrate her past and present instead of trying to escape from painful memories. The trauma of losing her research team in Italy would always be part of her story, but it was no longer the ending of her story. It had become a crucial chapter that prepared her for the moment when her community needed her knowledge and courage. At the rebuilt library, Sarah was waiting with a cup of tea, as had become their custom every Tuesday morning before Adele began her mail route. "Any interesting deliveries today?" Sarah asked, as she always did. "Just the usual mix," Adele replied, "though I did get some unusual seismic readings this morning from the monitoring station. Nothing dangerous, just a reminder that our mountain friend is still active and we need to stay alert." "Are you worried?" "No, not worried. Prepared. There's a big difference. Worry is fear about things you can't control. Preparedness is taking reasonable actions based on known risks. We know Mount Erebus is an active volcano now. We know it could erupt again someday. We also know we can detect the warning signs and respond effectively when that happens." As they sat together, looking out at Mount Erebus, Adele felt a deep sense of satisfaction and purpose. She had found her calling, not in choosing between her scientific background and her community service, but in combining them both in ways that served others. The mountain stood tall and beautiful in the distance, occasionally releasing small puffs of steam that reminded everyone of its power. But now it was watched constantly by sophisticated monitoring equipment managed by professional geologists. The community was educated about volcanic hazards and had regular evacuation drills. Most importantly, there were strong relationships of trust between neighbors that would make any future emergency response more effective. "You know," Sarah said thoughtfully, stirring sugar into her tea, "I used to think heroes were people who did one big, dramatic thing to save the day. But watching you over these years, I've learned that real heroism is usually about doing many small, consistent things that build up to make the big difference when it's needed."
Adele nodded. Heroism is often about using whatever skills and knowledge you have to serve others, even when it's difficult or scary. It's about choosing to care about your community enough to take risks for their well-being. And it's about learning from your mistakes and failures instead of letting them stop you from trying to help people. The people I lost in Italy taught me things I needed to know to save people in Millbrook. Their deaths weren't meaningless if they helped prevent other deaths. Sarah raised her teacup. To the team that didn't come home, and to the community that did. To second chances, Adele replied, and to the courage to use them well. As the years passed, Adele became increasingly involved in education programs that taught children about natural hazards and community preparedness. She developed curriculum materials that were used in elementary and high schools throughout volcanic regions of the United States and several other countries. The children who grow up understanding these risks will become adults who know how to protect their communities, she explained to teachers during training workshops. Education is our best long-term strategy for reducing disaster casualties. One of her favorite programs was the Young Volcano Watchers Club she started at Millbrook Elementary School. Children learned basic geology, practiced using simple monitoring instruments, and developed emergency preparedness skills through games and activities. 8-year-old Maria Santos, daughter of the teacher who had been one of the first to support Adele's warnings, was particularly enthusiastic about the program. "Ms. Adel, when I grow up, I want to be a volcano scientist like you," Maria announced during one of the club meetings. "What kind of volcano scientist do you want to be?" Adel asked. The kind that saves people. Like you did with my family? Adele felt a familiar tightness in her throat. You know, Maria, there are many ways to save people. You could be a researcher who studies how volcanoes work. You could be an emergency manager who helps communities prepare for disasters. You could be a teacher who helps other people understand these risks. Or you could be someone who lives in a community and stays alert to dangers, ready to help your neighbors when they need it. Can I be all of those things? You can be whatever combination feels right for your life. The important thing is to use your gifts to help others. The Young Volcano Watchers program became a model that was replicated in other communities near active volcanoes. Children who participated developed not just knowledge about geological hazards, but also confidence in their ability to contribute to community safety and resilience. Some of the original Millbrook children who had been evacuated as teenagers were now young adults starting families of their own. They had grown up knowing that their town had faced a life-threatening disaster and survived because neighbors had cared for each other and acted on good information. This experience had shaped their approach to civic engagement and community responsibility in ways that extended far beyond volcanic hazards. They were more likely to volunteer for emergency services, more willing to help neighbors during crises, and more appreciative of the importance of scientific knowledge in public decision-making. The Millbrook generation, as researchers sometimes called them, became a case study in how communities could build resilience through shared experience and collective preparation. 10 years after the eruption, Dr. Adel Thompson had become one of the most respected names in community-based disaster preparedness worldwide. Her Millbrook model had been implemented in volcanic communities in Indonesia, the Philippines, Italy, Chile, and Japan, saving thousands of lives through early warning systems that combined scientific monitoring with strong community relationships. The model emphasized three key principles that had emerged from the Millbrook experience. First, the importance of having trained observers embedded within at-risk communities. People who understood both the science of hazard detection and the social dynamics of effective communication. These observers didn't need to be professional scientists, but they needed scientific training and community trust. Second, the necessity of developing rapid decision-making processes that could respond to emerging threats without waiting for perfect information or lengthy bureaucratic reviews. This required pre-established protocols that balanced the risks of false alarms against the risks of delayed response. Third, the critical role of social relationships and community trust in effective disaster response. Technical warning systems were only as good as people's willingness to believe and act on the warnings they provided. The United Nations invited Adele to serve on their International Panel for Disaster Risk Reduction. The World Health Organization asked her to help develop guidelines for evacuating medical facilities in volcanic regions. The International Association of Volcanology gave her their highest award for contributions to volcanic hazard mitigation. But perhaps the recognition that meant most to her came from an unexpected source. The Italian government, working with the families of the researchers who had died at Vesuvius, established the Vesuvius Memorial Fellowship for young scientists studying volcanic hazards. Dr. Elena Rossi, representing the Italian National Institute of Geophysics, presented the first fellowship to a graduate student from the University of Naples. This fellowship honors the memory of 6 brilliant researchers who died doing work they loved, work that was essential for protecting communities from volcanic hazards, Dr. Rossi said at the ceremony. But it also honors Dr. Adel Thompson, who survived that tragedy and went on to use what she learned to save lives in other communities. Her colleagues' sacrifice was not in vain, because their survivor carried forward their mission of using science to protect people. Adele attended the ceremony in Italy, her first return to the country since the disaster 15 years earlier. Standing at the memorial erected for her former teammates, she finally felt that she had found a way to honor their memory that they would have approved. "You taught me that science is only valuable when it serves humanity," she said quietly to the memorial. "I hope I've been a good student." Back in Millbrook, life continued with the comfortable rhythms of a small town that had learned to live confidently with natural risks. The weekly farmers market featured vegetables grown in soil enriched by volcanic ash. The annual Volcano Safety Day combined practical emergency drills with community celebration. Children grew up learning to read the moods of Mount Erebus as naturally as they learned to read weather patterns. Adele still delivered mail 3 days a week, still rode her bicycle through the familiar streets, still stopped for tea with Sarah at the library. But now she also traveled regularly to other communities, helping them develop their own preparedness programs. In the Philippines, she worked with villages near Mount Mayon to establish community monitoring networks. In Italy, she helped develop evacuation procedures for towns near Mount Etna. In Chile, she trained local leaders to recognize signs of volcanic unrest in the Andes. Each community presented unique challenges: different types of volcanic hazards, different cultural approaches to risk and authority, different economic and social constraints on emergency response. But the fundamental principles remain the same: good science, clear communication, community trust, and the courage to act when action was needed. "Every community has its own personality," she would tell new groups of trainees. "Your job is not to copy exactly what worked in Millbrook. Your job is to understand the principles that made our response effective and adapt them to your own situation." One of her most challenging assignments was working with a mining town in Guatemala, where the local economy depended entirely on operations near an active volcano. The residents knew the risks, but felt they had no economic alternatives to staying in the dangerous area. "Dr. Thompson, it's easy to evacuate when you have somewhere else to go," explained Carlos Martinez, a miner whose family had lived in the area for generations. "But if we leave, we lose everything. We have no money, no skills for other work, no relatives in safe areas who can support us." Adele worked with the community for 6 months, not just on volcanic monitoring and evacuation procedures, but on economic development strategies that could provide alternative livelihoods for residents who chose to relocate. The project became a model for addressing the complex relationship between natural hazards and economic vulnerability. Disaster preparedness isn't just about having good emergency plans, she realized. It's about giving people realistic options for living safely. Sometimes that means changing entire communities' economic foundations, not just their evacuation procedures. On her 50th birthday, Adele decided to climb Mount Erebus. Not to the dangerous summit area where volcanic gases and unstable ground made access hazardous, but to an observation point about halfway up the mountain where she could see both the volcanic features and the rebuilt town of Millbrook spread out in the valley below. She made the climb with Sarah and Dr. Park, both of whom had become close friends through their shared experience of the evacuation and rebuilding. The 3 women carried a picnic lunch and planned to spend the afternoon reflecting on how much their lives had changed since the eruption. From the observation point, they could see the monitoring equipment that now dotted the mountain slopes: seismometers, gas sensors, thermal cameras, and communication relay stations that sent real-time data to the geological survey offices. What had once been an unmonitored and underestimated threat was now one of the most carefully watched volcanoes in North America. "It's hard to believe that 10 years ago, nobody was paying attention to this mountain," Sarah said, looking up at the active crater where steam and occasional ash clouds still rose regularly. "The mountain was always dangerous," Adele replied. "We just weren't listening to what it was trying to tell us. Now we're listening, so we can live safely with the risk instead of pretending it doesn't exist. Dr. Park unpacked their lunch and spread a blanket on a flat area with a good view. I've been thinking about something lately. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't moved to Millbrook? If some other mail carrier had been doing that route when the mountains started showing signs of activity? Adele considered the question seriously. I think about that sometimes. I wonder if someone else might have noticed the changes and figured out what they meant. Maybe a farmer who had lived here long enough to know that ground temperatures weren't normally that variable. Maybe a teacher who had studied earth science and recognized the pattern. Maybe someone who would have acted faster and saved even more lives. But I also think about the people who might not have survived if I hadn't been here. Mrs. Chen, who was so frightened about leaving her house, the patients at the medical clinic who needed special assistance evacuating, all the families who trusted my warnings because they knew me personally from 3 years of mail delivery. I think we were all where we needed to be when we needed to be there. My scientific training, my personal experience with volcanic disaster, my relationships in the community, it all came together at exactly the right moment. Sarah raised her water bottle. To being in the right place, at the right time, with the right knowledge and the courage to use it. To second chances and third chapters, Dr. Park added. To communities that take care of each other, Adele concluded. As they ate their lunch and watched clouds form around the mountain peak, Adele felt a deep sense of contentment. She had found a way to live with her past instead of running from it, to use her pain to prevent others' pain, and to build a life that honored both her lost colleagues and her living community. The mountain that had once represented only danger and trauma in her mind had become something more complex, a force of nature that demanded respect and preparation, but also a teacher that had shown her community how to be strong together. 15 years after the Millbrook eruption, Adele published a book called Listening to the Mountain: Community-Based Disaster Preparedness in an Uncertain World. The book combined scientific information about volcanic hazards with practical guidance for community organizing and personal stories from the Millbrook experience. The book became required reading in emergency management programs and was translated into 12 languages. But more importantly, it inspired communities around the world to take more active roles in their own disaster preparedness, rather than relying entirely on government agencies and professional responders. The most important message of this book, Adele wrote in the introduction, is that ordinary people have extraordinary power to protect themselves and their neighbors when they combine good information, clear thinking, and mutual care. You don't need special training or official authority to recognize emerging threats and take appropriate action. You just need to pay attention, trust your knowledge, and care enough about your community to speak up when you see danger. The book included chapters on recognizing natural hazard warning signs, communicating effectively about uncertain risks, organizing community evacuation procedures, and building the social relationships that make emergency response more effective. But it also included more personal reflections on trauma, resilience, and finding meaning in difficult experiences. I spent 3 years trying to forget my scientific training and live a completely different life, she wrote. I thought I could escape from the pain of losing my colleagues by abandoning the work we had done together. But I learned that our most difficult experiences often prepare us for our most important contributions. The tragedy that I thought had ended my career as a scientist actually prepared me for the moment when my community needed scientific knowledge to survive. The book's final chapter was titled Living with Active Mountains and focused on the long-term challenge of maintaining preparedness and vigilance in communities near natural hazards. Disasters are rare events, but the risks that create disasters are constant, she explained. Volcanic eruptions might happen once in a generation or once in a century, but the geological processes that cause eruptions are always present. Our challenge is to remain appropriately prepared for low probability, high impact events without allowing fear or complacency to dominate our daily lives. The solution is to build preparedness into the normal fabric of community life. Education systems that teach hazard awareness, social networks that support rapid communication, economic structures that allow for flexible response to emergencies, and cultural traditions that celebrate both individual courage and collective responsibility. The book won several awards and established Adel as one of the leading voices in disaster preparedness education. But she continued to live in Millbrook, continued to deliver mail part-time, and continued to find her greatest satisfaction in the daily work of maintaining community relationships and watching over her neighbors' safety. 20 years after the eruption, Dr. Adel Thompson stood again in the bell tower of the Methodist Church, looking out over Millbrook and up at Mount Erebus. But this time, instead of ringing alarm bells, she was installing a new piece of equipment, an automated early warning siren that could be activated remotely if volcanic monitoring stations detected dangerous changes in the mountain's behavior. The siren was connected to a network of monitoring stations that provided real-time data to emergency management offices in 3 states. Computer algorithms analyzed seismic patterns, gas emissions, ground deformation, and thermal changes, looking for the combinations of factors that preceded volcanic eruptions. But the automated systems were also connected to human observers, a network of trained community members who had learned to recognize volcanic warning signs and who could provide local knowledge that complemented the instrumental data. Maria Santos, now 18 and preparing to enter college to study geology, was one of the newest members of the Observer Network. The little girl who had wanted to be a volcano scientist was now well on her way to achieving that goal. "Ms. Adel, do you think Mount Erebus will erupt again in my lifetime?" Maria asked as they calibrated the new warning system. "Probably," Adel replied. "Active volcanoes typically erupt multiple times across decades or centuries. But if it does erupt again, we'll be ready. We'll detect the warning signs early, we'll communicate effectively with the community, and we'll evacuate safely. That's the difference between living in ignorance of natural risks and living in informed preparation for them." "Are you scared?" Adel considered the question. "I'm not scared of the volcano. I'm respectful of its power, and I'm committed to staying prepared. But fear isn't the right emotion for dealing with known risks that you can prepare for. Fear is for unknown dangers. This danger is known, and we know how to respond to it. What I am scared of," she continued, "is complacency. I'm scared of people forgetting the lessons we learned 20 years ago. I'm scared of future generations taking our preparedness for granted and losing the knowledge and social connections that keep communities safe. That's why your generation is so important, Maria. You'll be the leaders when I'm too old to climb bell towers and install warning systems. Your job is to maintain the knowledge and the community relationships that make effective disaster response possible." As they finished installing the warning system, Adele looked out over the town she had helped save and rebuild. Children were walking home from school, stopping to pet dogs and collect leaves for school projects. Adults were finishing their work days and preparing family dinners. Elderly residents were tending gardens and visiting with neighbors. It was an ordinary day in an extraordinary community, a place that had faced its worst fear and learned that it could survive and even thrive by working together with wisdom, courage, and mutual care. Mount Erebus stood silent against the evening sky, occasionally releasing small puffs of steam that reminded everyone of its power. But it was no longer an ignored and underestimated threat. It was a respected neighbor, carefully watched and thoughtfully prepared for, a part of the community's landscape and identity. Adele climbed down from the bell tower and retrieved her bicycle. There were still a few pieces of mail to deliver before the end of her route, neighbors to check on, and relationships to maintain. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to serve her community. The mountain would continue to be active. The monitoring equipment would continue to collect data, and the people of Millbrook would continue to live their lives with the confidence that comes from being prepared for whatever nature might bring their way. And somewhere in the world, another community near another dangerous mountain was learning to listen to what their landscape was trying to tell them, guided by the lessons learned in a small town that had faced its greatest challenge and discovered its greatest strength: the power of ordinary people taking extraordinary care of each other. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We'd love to hear what inspired you the most. And where in the world are you watching from? Let us know below.